Welcome, friends. Thank you for choosing to study with us today from the holy book we call the Bible. We're studying from the fourth chapter of John as we are looking at the gospel of belief. And as we look in the fourth chapter of John, we find a circumstance that is recorded only and solely by John. It is the record of a nobleman. He was a man that was in the service of the king. And he was one that had a son that was at the very point of death. The Bible says that he'd heard that Jesus had come out of Judea into Galilee, and he left where he was in Capernaum and sought Jesus in Cana. And he found Jesus. And he told him about his child and said his son was sick at the point of death. He said, "Come down and heal him." Jesus said to him, "Except you see signs and wonders, you will in no wise believe." But the nobleman said, "Sir, come down there, my child die." Jesus said, "Go your way, your son lives." And he believed Jesus, and he started the journey home. Ere he reached home, servants came to him with the gladsome news. They met him, and he met him with these words, "Your son lives." And he said, "When did he begin to amend?" And they said, "Yesterday, at the seventh hour, the fever left him." And he knew that it was that very hour that Jesus said, "Your son lived." And he believed with all his house. Now, sometimes this story is confused with another story, more familiar to us, the story of a centurion. The record of that story is found in Matthew, the 8th chapter, and Luke, the 7th chapter. It is also a story of a man's faith. He was a centurion. He led the Jewish nation. He built for them a synagogue. And he had a servant that was grievously ill. And he said to certain rulers of that synagogue, or of the Jews, "Appeal to Jesus for my servant." And they did. And they said, "He loves our nation." And Jesus said, "I'll arise and go." And the centurion sent word to Jesus and said, "No need for you to come. I'm a man under authority. I say to one of my servants, go and do, and he goes. To my soldiers, come, and they come. You just speak the word, and my servant will be healed." And Jesus was astonished. He said, "I've not found so great faith in all of Israel." And these two accounts of healing are very similar, yet they're not the same. This is another of the accounts that John records for posterity. We would not know, were it not for this book called the Gospel of John. There are similarities between the nobleman and the centurion. For instance, we notice that both these men were men of authority. One is called a nobleman, the other was a centurion. Both these men were from Capernaum, and both of these were ones that sought healing for someone that was very dear to them. And both of them recognized Jesus as a source by which they might find help and healing for their loved one. But now, while there were similarities, there were things that they were radically different in. The nobleman was very likely a Jew. A nobleman was one that served the king, and the king was one that was of the Jewish religion. But the centurion was clearly a Gentile. He was a centurion. Secondly, the nobleman sought help for a son. The centurion sought help for a servant. Thirdly, we find that the nobleman felt that Jesus had to come to his house to help him. And the centurion said, "Don't come. Not necessary. You're a man of authority. I'm a man of authority. You just say the word. My servant will be healed. When we look at this nobleman, we see that his faith was tested. When he came to Jesus, he said, "Come down. My child is sick at the point of death. Come down and heal him." Jesus tested this man's faith. He knew all about that man, just like earlier in this 4th chapter. He knew all about the Samaritan woman. When she wanted the water, that she would never need to come to that fountain anymore to drink. She says, she was told, "You go call your husband." She said, "Don't have one." Jesus said, "You told the truth. You don't have a husband. You've had 5. You live with a man that's not your husband now. You've told the truth." Jesus knew that. And he knew about this nobleman too. He knew his weaknesses. He knew that being a Jew, he wanted a sign, a miracle. Remember, earlier in the gospel, we saw in the 2nd chapter where that Jesus, beginning his ministry, had cleansed the temple, drove out all those that were making merchandise of God's house. Said, "Care of these things hence. Don't make my Father's house a house of merchandise." He cleansed the temple. And when we look at that, they said, "Give us a sign since you do these things." Jesus said, "Destroy this temple. 3 days I'll raise it up again." He was speaking of his body. Oftentimes during his ministry, Jews would come to him and said, "Teacher, we'll see a sign from you." And Paul wrote of the characteristics of the Jew and the Gentile in 1 Corinthians, the 1st chapter, and said, "Jews seek after a sign." Oh, yes. Jesus knew the weakness of this man, and he told this man, "Except you see a sign and wonder, you're not going to believe." But this didn't deter the man. Just like the Syrophoenician, his faith was tested. Remember, this woman came to the master. She wasn't a Jew, but she had needs just as much as a Jew had. She had a daughter that was grievously vexed with a demon. She wanted the Lord to heal them. The Lord said, "I wasn't sent to the Gentile. I was sent only to the lost sheep, the house of Israel." She persisted, "Lord, help me." And he said, "It's not me to take the children's bread and give it to dogs." And she said, "Yes, Lord, that's true. But the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the children's table." And Jesus said, "Woman, great your faith." Jesus tested her faith. She passed. Jesus tested this man. Would he pass? Jesus said, "Except you see signs and wonders, you won't believe." And the man said, "Come down. My child will die." And Jesus, without giving him a sign or anything, just said, "You go your way. Your son lives." And he believed Jesus. He left without that sign that was so important to Jews. All he had was the simple word of Jesus. But he had faith in Jesus. And that faith was further confirmed when the servants came and said, "Your son's alive. He's well." And the father said, "Well, didn't a man start to get better?" They said, "Didn't he start to get better? The fever left him. He's well. He's whole. When?" And the servant said, "The 7th hour." And the man knew that was the very time that Jesus spoke to him. And once more, the record says, and he believed in his house. When we look at this, we see the importance and the significance of faith. The Hebrew writer said, "Without faith, it's impossible to please God. He that comes to God must believe that he is, that he's a rewarder of them that diligently seek him." Paul wrote, "We walk by faith and not by sight." And Paul quoted from an Old Testament writer who said, "The just shall live by faith." John, the writer of the gospel, wrote in his epistles, in the first, So then faith is the victory that overcomes the world. Yes, we must have faith. We cannot please God without it. Jesus tested the faith of the Syrophoenician woman. He tested the faith of this nobleman. We're saved by faith, but not by faith only. James said, you see then how the works of man is justified, and not by faith only. This nobleman's faith was tested. He wanted to see signs and wonders. That was the disposition of Jews. Jesus didn't give him that. He said, your son lives, go home. The Lord tells me to do certain things. I must believe that he's the Son of God. And then he gives me an astonishing statement. He that believes and is baptized shall be saved. He that believes not shall be condemned. I must believe. Why? Because Jesus said so. Will my faith lead me to do what he did? Well, that depends on whether or not I really believe in God or not. And so we look at this man. As we see the testing of his faith. It was weak, yes, but he had faith. And as we look at this man's faith, weak as it were, it brought it to the right source. And his faith grew and grew, and he pleased God. My friend, like this nobleman, we must act on our faith. And like this nobleman, our faith must grow and grow. Thank you for listening. In our next study from John, we'll look at the question that was one that was frequently questioned of Jesus. And Jesus asked his nation, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath day?